Great. So in this hour, we're going to talk about the main non-Christian ethical systems. So I'm going to be covering the three main systems that are used in non-Christian ethics: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. Now, of course, there are other systems, and certainly during the 20th century at least, it seemed every new ethicist came up with a new system of how we do ethics. But you can pretty much say they're all versions of one of these three main systems. So, let's get going. The first one we're going to talk about is deontology, championed by Immanuel Kant. So most people will identify deontology with Kant, the 18th century philosopher, who wrote a very influential essay called What is Enlightenment? So, and if you're ever wondering, well, what is the Enlightenment? That's the essay which largely encapsulated and drove a lot of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. So very much an Enlightenment philosopher. And one of the things he wanted to do was redefine ethics, because he was so impressed with Isaac Newton and the way that Newton had systematized the principles of the physical universe. And Kant wanted to do that for the ethical universe, because he believed that the universe was ethical. It really frustrated him that he couldn't keep it to this life. He wanted it to be the case that in this life the ethical people would be rewarded and the wicked people would be punished. And it was very annoying that that didn't seem to happen in the world. So he did postulate, you have to have God as a regulative principle, and you have to have justice after death, otherwise the universe just doesn't work. And he wanted to say, well, given that the universe is ethical, what are the laws of ethics? Which I think is a bit ironic, given that he was one of the people most responsible for separating the rule of ethics into opinion as opposed to knowledge by saying, the physical world is what you know about. That's where you have facts. And then there's the noumenal world, he called it, the world of opinion, of other things that you can't ever know. And by doing so, I think that was one of the key moments in Western history, at least, which said that things like religion or ethical opinions or morality, they're all things that you can't know for sure. They can't be universal. Whereas Kant wanted to say, yes, they are universal, but he sort of sabotaged his own system. But that's a whole other lecture. Sorry. We're talking about what was Kant's ethical system. Deontology was basically about doing your duty. Deon, Greek word for duty or obligation. You do what is right. That's what ethics is about. How do you know what is right? Well, you have the rules. Well, how do you find out what the rules are? Kant basically had one principle for this. You do the thing that you think everyone ought to do. So he came to this by reasoning that there are some things that you do in order to get something else. There are some things that you do in order to achieve some goal. If I want to be rich, I should work hard. If I want to be thin, I should exercise more. So these are what he called hypothetical imperatives. They're imperatives, they're saying, well, you should exercise more, but you should, given that that's your goal. It's not a universal law. Everyone should exercise more. Some people are already exercising quite enough. But if you have that goal, then that's what you should do. So these are the hypothetical imperatives. But then there are what he called categorical imperatives, things that are just true for all time. They just are. And these are the sorts of statements that should guide ethics. So from this principle, he derives some fundamental rules. Don't murder. That's something that all people should follow all the time. Treat people as ends in themselves. Saying that's something that we want everyone to be following all the time. So that's how you work out what's ethical. You follow this principle of what do you want everyone to be doing. So, should I cheat on my exam? Well, no, because if everyone cheated on the exam, then exams would mean nothing. Although you could follow what Yossarian said in Catch-22. Well, if everyone was doing that, I'd be stupid to do anything else, wouldn't I? I don't know if people still read Catch-22. It is a classic American novel, so you should read it if you haven't. It's a good system. It makes sense. You can see how that works. It's a good principle. Well, what should everyone be doing? Then that should be the basis of our ethics. It's easy to follow. It's easy to understand. And especially in Kant's version, most people would agree with it. We should treat people as ends in themselves, not as means to some other end. It also suits human nature in many ways because there's part of us that likes having the rules to follow. Because then we know that we're good people. We know that we're doing the right thing because we are following the rules. Many Christians treat Christian ethics this way. Being a good Christian means you're following the rules. And there is a divine command theory of Christian ethics, which sees Christians in terms of, well, what has God commanded? So you do Christian ethics by working out the rules, and you work out the rules by finding out what God says. And God has said it in a convenient 10-point guide. Wasn't that useful of him? It's his word, so we know it's right. So we have the rules now. We follow the 10 Commandments. And we might supplement them with the virtue lists of the New Testament. So we go through where Paul says, well, do these things, but don't do these things. Okay, that gives us a few more rules. Or what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, which helps us go deeper into the rules. So, okay, well, you might have thought that it just meant don't murder, but actually, you know, this applies to not hating people as well. And so it's not a bad system, and you can see why people are drawn to it. But I'd like you, just for 5 minutes now, get into your groups again and talk about what's good about this system for the non-Christian. Why do non-Christians like it, and why is it a good system? What doesn't work if a non-Christian follows the system? And then the same question for Christians. What's good about the system, and what doesn't work if you're a Christian trying to follow that system? So, yeah, just for a few minutes in your groups. Okay, can I call you back to the front, please? So what did we think? For the non-Christian first, what's good about this system? What works? It's simple, yes. And it means that you can set up structures for lots of people. It's practical. Yep.
It does sort of take you out of the centre of your thinking about what's right. It forces you to ask to level the playing field between you and everyone else. What would actually be good for everyone if we did it? In this particular circumstance, in which it's me, what do I think I should do? It decenters you.
It is good that it decenters me to say, well, the world isn't all about me. There are other people, and I need to consider everyone. Yep.
I mean, at the time that Kant produced this, presumably he's largely influenced by a system of principles of thought which were Christian influenced anyway. So what you would be a large number of people behaving potentially along the lines of what we thought to be a Christian consensus of behaviour, even if they're not Christians themselves.
Well, yes, Kant's system was very Christian. He grew up Christian. It was a very Christian culture. And so a lot of people's understanding of what this system applies to was certainly Christian. And the Christian system is a good way to work. That's why God created it that way. It's true. Mm-hmm. That's true. That is one of the weaknesses of the system, especially if, as you say, you're not a Christian and you start to think, well, actually, I don't agree with that rule. I don't think that's what everyone should be doing. It's, yeah. So, go on, yeah.
It's quite personalisable. You can say, I think this is what everyone should be doing, that's why I'm doing it. So I'm very justified in everything that I do, because I think everyone should do this, even if it's something that most people like or really.
That's true, yes, you do. It can be a way of justifying what you want to do. Say, well, yes, this is what everyone should be doing. And maybe that would end up in anarchy, but actually I think that's a good thing. So as a system, people do have a moral instinct. So whether you're Christian or non-Christian, people will have moral instinct. And people do have a sense of right and wrong. So in that sense, a deontological system works because people do have a sense of duty. And it does reflect God to some extent. Christian or non-Christian, we are created in the image of God. There will be ways in which our characters reflect God's values. And it does give us universal principles. So it worked for the Declaration of Human Rights. That is a list of things of people saying, we think this should be the case for everyone. It worked for the American Constitution. I mean, that's the basis of saying there are basically right things, and we will enshrine them, and that will be the basis of all our behaviour. But of course, the problem is, how do you know? What if you disagree with it? What if principles appear to clash? What if one person says, okay, we treat people as ends in themselves, that means every woman should have autonomy over her own body. Another person says we treat people as ends in themselves, that means that every unborn child has a right to life. The system itself doesn't tell us which one of those is going to be right. And of course it was easy for someone who was a European white male who never actually left the country, the city he was born in, to think that everyone would come to the same conclusions on moral questions. But it just doesn't account for the diversity of people, the diversity of cultures there are in the world. And if they disagree, what are you going to do? Okay, for Christians, why is it that Christians might be attracted to this as a way of doing ethics, of a way of working out a system of ethics?
Similar simplicity thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know what the Bible says about something, or you're just not quite sure, you think, what would everybody else do?
Yeah. And especially if you're in a Christian culture, or if you've grown up in a church, or you are in a church, you have absorbed certain principles. It is a way you can think about, well, how do I know what to do in this situation?
Seems as though thinking towards our neighbours.
Yes, it does. As we said before, it does take us out of ourselves, make us think, well, what would be the best thing for other people for me to do in this situation? And God does speak. Yep, go on.
So it is actually the case that the rules are applied to everyone. It's something that everyone wants to do.
Yes. Yes, and if you want a theological justification for that, think about Noah's covenant, which applied to the whole world. There's some good books being written on that. What's his name? Van Drewsen, is it? He wrote a very good book on Noah's covenant. Anyway, but yes, you can think about even theologically, there are ways that God's word does apply to everyone. God does give rules. He does command ethical things which apply to all of us, and we are meant to obey him. The problem, of course, is they're not detailed rules. We still have to work out, okay, but how does that apply in this situation? We need wisdom to know what applies when. And God doesn't actually give us those detailed rules. He expects us to grow in wisdom, to grow as changed people who are more and more approaching his character, who have in the image of Christ. There cannot possibly be enough rules to follow every situation. I mean, people have tried. If you read Richard Baxter, the Puritan, he wrote down rules that this is what the Christian should be in this situation, in that situation, if this factor changes, if this thing is different. But you can't do it. Life is too complicated. You cannot have a rule for every situation you're going to come up against. And if that's how you're thinking about ethics, it is very easy to fall into being judgmental because someone else is just not following the rules. And it makes us think that following the rules is what matters, when actually these are merely fruit of being in Christ with a changed character. And it's part of how ethics becomes detached from Christ, by setting up a system of rules and then thinking, well, okay, now I can follow the rules, and I forget that what really matters is being part of the vine, being in Christ. So in the end, for all its attractiveness, whether for non-Christians or for Christians, the idea of thinking about ethics as a set of right rules or even a set of right principles that you have to follow, that can't be what ethics is all about, because it's not comprehensive enough and it doesn't really capture what it is to live a changed life. Okay, well, non-Christians have recognised this, that it's not the end of thinking about ethics. And we found in the 19th century a whole different way of thinking about ethics and how do you decide what's the right thing to do arose. And this was consequentialism. The system has several forms, but basically it says that you work out what's right by looking at the consequences of your actions. And this is something, it really wasn't known at all in the ancient world, where you've got a lot of systems of ethics in the ancient world, but no one was really saying that's how you work out what's the right thing to do. It came essentially in the 19th century from utilitarianism, which was specifically the principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's how you work out what you should do. It's the thing that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, that's very particular. It's saying the thing that matters is people's happiness. What's happiness? Well, we still don't really know. I mean, that's a whole other book. How do you define it anyway? And what is it that you're looking at in terms of happiness? And does anyone have the right to define what another person's happiness is? Well, out of those sorts of discussions, the whole area of ethics became more generalised. To say we're not just looking at happiness, we're just thinking about consequences. And the consequences are what matters. So consequentialism is a generalised form of this. It says to decide what is the morally best thing to do, You weigh up the consequences of different actions and see, well, what's going to cause the best outcomes? Well, Christians want good outcomes. And so we often use this form of reasoning. So should I give my money to this organisation or that organisation? Well, I might look at the consequences. Which one will result in the gospel being preached more effectively? Which one will follow the most honest principles in distributing the money? Should I help this person I see on my street here, or should I help that person I know about in another city? Well, which one can I do the most good for? Maybe I should help the person who's right here because I can maintain a relationship and have an ongoing helpful relationship with them. But maybe that person in the other city actually has a greater need, and so I can do more good for them. It's a common way of thinking. It's how we weigh up decisions. Should I punish myself? Should I punish my child for doing this thing, or should I show mercy to the child on this occasion? I mean, parents often use that way of thinking to weigh up, well, what's the best thing to do right now? It's a very normal human way of thinking, what's going to be the outcome, and that determines what do I do. So in your groups again, I want you to go through the same discussion. Oh, I forgot. Okay, so same questions. What's good about ethics if you're a non-Christian, and what doesn't work if you're non-Christian? And then the same for a Christian. What works about this system, what doesn't work? So in your groups again for 5 minutes. Okay, let's pull that back together. Okay, now I realise it is slightly artificial dividing this up between Christians and non-Christians, but this helps you think through the strengths and weaknesses of the system. So we'll start with non-Christians. What's good about consequentialism as a system, as a method for deciding on our ethics?
It forces you to think about the outcomes of the decisions you're going to make.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're conscientiously following this system, you're not going to miss so many negative consequences.
Yep. Yes. And it is important to think through decisions, think through potential ramifications. Consequences do matter. Okay, what are some other strengths here?
But it helps you if you've got to ration resources.
Sorry?
If you've got to ration resources.
Yes.
It helps you.
Yes, when you have to ration resources, when there are shortages, we're not going to be in perfect situations. So the NHS will have limited resources. You will have to decide, does this person get the treatment or does that person? You've got to have some basis on deciding which one actually gets the money for treatment. Yes. So it especially works for individuals, and this is what a lot of people have said about consequentialism. The problem with talking about happiness is that you can't decide for someone else what's going to make them happy. It's a better system if you let people decide for themselves what they want what the best consequence for themselves is. And it also helps you as an individual to make decisions. So, there are ways in which, as a system, it works in that sense. What's the biggest problem with this system? Yep. Benefiting the majority? Yep, that's certainly a problem. Yes. Yeah, so it's, the minority still matters, But if you've got a system that says it has to benefit the majority, yeah, that's a problem.
It sort of requires a value system already to define what is good consequence and what isn't.
Yeah, exactly, yes. How do you define what the best consequence is? That's a major problem. Yes, sorry. Consequences are unpredictable. And actually, I think that is the biggest problem with the system. We can't tell the future. We keep kidding ourselves that we can, but we actually can't. We don't know what's going to happen. All sorts of unexpected things can happen. Factors can intervene that we weren't anticipating. Yes, it is good to think through possible consequences, but they're still only possible. We don't actually know what's going to happen. It's consequences, even our potential consequences, they're frequently impossible to compare. This is one of the major problems with the environmental protests we're having at the moment, is that how do you... a lot of the arguments are put in consequentialist terms. So, yes, by blocking the M25 today, I may have stopped an ambulance getting someone to hospital. But we have to, stop oil because otherwise millions of people in the future will die. How can you actually compare that? Potential consequences for millions in the future versus the real consequence of one person right now. Especially if it's something even more abstract. If I build this road today, that will help me get food to starving people, but it will increase carbon output, and so it might hurt people in the future. You're talking about different things on different scales. You can't actually compare them. At least when it was happiness, you were just talking about one thing. It's the thing that's hard to measure and hard to define, but it is just one thing. But now you get consequentialist arguments in terms of things that just cannot be compared. Also, go on.
Deforestation, the consequence of that, like the rainforest in Brazil. Well, chopping trees and what's good, the benefits, the negative thing is obvious. But why don't they? Yeah, is that the popular that people worry about the consequences?
Yes. It's a very difficult argument to win. And a lot of the argument really does just depend on people's emotions. It really depends on swaying people to your point of view because, chopping down trees in the Amazon sounds so bad, and we can make people feel really bad about it, especially if you're in the West and you're not really affected by the trees. That your livelihood doesn't depend on having farming land in the Amazon. It's very easy for you to be persuaded that, of course, chopping down the trees is the worst thing. But how actually are we going to weigh up the arguments?
Adverts, don't we, to the habitats like Jaguars or whatever you see, and they say, we want to sponsor Jaguar, pay money. And we just say, stop chopping trees down. And
Yes, that's right. So there are certainly ethical issues in environmentalism, in saving animals. But just talking about consequences isn't actually going to solve the issue because they're too difficult to compare and we don't actually know what's going to happen in the future. And also, in a lot of these issues, how do you decide what's a good consequence? Yes, you've got to have some other value system to decide what's the consequence you want. If we had much more explicit sex education in primary schools, children would feel much freer to experiment as teenagers. Wouldn't that be a good thing? Well, you've begged the question. The consequentialist argument is not going to make the decision for you as to whether that's ethical or not. You already have to have a value system about what's good. And of course, that's the problem for Christians as well as non-Christians. We don't know the future. And it only really works if you're weighing up options that are ethically equal. Yes, it is practical to think through consequences, but it's not going to decide the ethics of the matter. It only works if you already know roughly what ethical options you have. So, yes, if you have two equally good or equally neutral options, should I wear red socks today or blue socks? Ethically, pretty much equal. So I can be very practical in thinking, well, the red socks are dirty. I'd smell bad if I wore them, so I'm not going to. You know, if you do have roughly equal options, then yes, it can be practically useful to think through consequences. If treating two different people on the NHS, they're both good things to do. And so, yes, it can be a useful heuristic to think through consequences as to which one gets the resources. It's also going to be very hard to do, and we shouldn't ever kid ourselves that consequentialism makes the decision easier. But there are real traps in using consequentialism as a system for making decisions. It is so easy for it to justify sinful actions because we can spin our decisions. We spin the options, we spin the consequences, and we do that as a society and we do it as individuals. We will make it look as if we're making an ethical decision when actually we're just justifying what our sinful hearts wanted to do. And it's an excellent method for doing that because you can persuade people that what you're proposing will have the best outcomes, especially when we don't know the future. Moreover, if this is our method for making decisions and we get it wrong, we can do a huge amount of harm. A lot of the legal debates over censorship in the 60s and 70s were based on largely consequentialist arguments, saying if we remove the censorship laws, then art will have a much greater capacity to flourish. People will be able to express themselves, will have a much more understanding and flourishing community. That's not actually what happened. The weakening of censorship laws resulted in a whole lot of pornography. And even if we could change that now, even if we could go back to the same laws that were in place in the 60s, which, you know, is almost impossible to do, but even if we did, we can't undo the harm that's been done to people and to society in the meantime. So actually, it's really a non-method of doing ethics. For all the ways in which it's maybe a practical way of making decisions, it will not actually tell you what is the more ethical decision. You have to have so many other things in place before you can use it ethically, to the point where it may be a decision-making heuristic. It's not actually a method of doing ethics. And it leaves out very important ethical instincts that we have. So, for instance, Socrates debated the issue of, if I can save another person's life by sacrificing my own life, well, is that the good thing to do? And most people have agreed, well, yes, that's a very noble thing to do, to sacrifice yourself in order to save another person. But if you're a consequentialist, you have done nothing that's particularly good because the outcome is exactly the same. One person died. Either way, one person dies. It's exactly the same ethical outcome. But we want to say, no, it's not the same. Sacrificing myself for another person is a noble thing. It's better than being selfish and wanting to preserve myself at someone else's expense. So there are important ways in which consequentialism can be very unethical. Nonetheless, it remains pretty much the best established ethical method in society, which is somewhat dangerous. But it's important that you can recognise when people are making consequentialist arguments, so you can think through what are they actually doing and how are you actually going to answer that, how are you going to respond to that. Okay. Well, our third major method that we're going to talk about that gets used in the non-Christian world is virtue ethics. Aristotle is the famous name here. It is the method of most ancient ethical systems. And it's usually not specifically about ethics in the ancient world, but about how to be happy, how to have the most enjoyable life, the most fruitful and flourishing life, which can be a refreshing change, especially if you've gone through a lot of the history of Christian ethics. Christians can get awfully miserable about ethics. And it just seems like you've just got to grit your teeth and do the right thing even though you don't want to. Well, no, the ancients are saying actually doing the right thing is how you have the happy life. It's how you have the most positive and flourishing life. And yes, I know how you define happiness and flourishing is a debate, but anyway. Virtue ethics is basically thinking about ethics not so much as a matter of what actions I should take or what is the most ethical decision to make in a situation, but what kind of person am I training myself to be? It says people are ethical rather than saying actions are ethical. An ethical action is simply the thing that an ethical person does. So the focus in ethics should be on an ethical person, and the ethical actions and decisions will follow. That's not what ethical systems in the modern world have usually focused on. They've usually been more about actions and situations, and so you get scenarios like the ones we started with in the discussion groups. In this situation, given these factors, what is the best ethical approach to it? And you might do it in different ways. And those situations, those scenarios you're given, I set them up in the way they did to try and get you to see that there are different approaches you could take to working out what's the most ethical thing to do. What rule should I follow here? Should I follow a rule about I must not hack into other systems? That's unethical and illegal, so regardless of what I'm doing, I shouldn't do that. Or should we follow the consequences? Well, even if it is illegal for me to hack into someone else's system, it's going to save lives, and that's the important thing. So there are different strategies that people use to decide what is the most ethical thing in this situation, but virtue ethics comes at it sort of from right angles and says, no, what's the implication for the character of the person involved? How do we train people themselves to be more ethical? So take, for instance, if you had, as a society, a discussion about whether capital punishment is ethical. It's the sort of discussions that happened in this country last century and is still happening in the United States as different states have different decisions on that. And you might talk about questions like, should criminals ever be executed for crimes? And you discuss things like whether a person ever deserves to die, whether criminal justice is about retributive justice at all. Is that what the criminal justice system is meant to do, give people what they deserve? Or is the system there to help rehabilitate people? Or to be an example so that you might prevent other, whether it has a deterrent effect on other criminals. But the discussion doesn't generally include the effect on the moral character of the executioner. The discussion doesn't generally include, for what does it train people? How does it train their moral character for people living in that sort of society? So, and I'm not presuming either answer in that, but that is a question that matters when you're talking about moral issues in society. What does it do for the moral character of the people living in that society? So we don't often get virtue ethics included in public discussion. And a lot of Christians don't really talk about virtue ethics in their discussion of Christian ethics. A lot of the Christian discussion is about issues. What's the Christian attitude towards abortion? What's the Christian attitude towards IVF? Or, or towards environmentalism. We talk about issues, but actually a lot of biblical ethics is virtue ethics. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is concerned with our hearts. So he says living in the kingdom is not so much about rules to live by as about whether your heart is sincere in obedience, whether your motives match your actions. These are the things that the sermon talks about. And most of what we tend to read as rules in the New Testament is actually about having a transformed heart. It's actually about these are the sorts of things that show that you are living in a manner worthy of the gospel, that you have been transformed. So most of the actual material we have on Christian ethics is virtue ethics. It's about having a transformed heart, a heart that loves others and puts them first, that is humble before God, that desires what God desires. And so a lot about Christian ethics, I think, would be better put in terms of how do we work at transforming ourselves? How do we actually work at being in step with the Spirit, in having renewed desires so that we do desire the things of God and not desire the things of the sinful heart? And if I can just stop there for a little advertisement, that is precisely why I wrote a book on anxiety, which is up the back there, because fear is a major ethical issue. Fear is what often stops us doing from what is ethical. And having a transformed heart is what the New Testament is often pushing us towards in becoming this kind of changed person who will live out what we call the ethical life. Well, how are we going for time? I think we won't go into groups again. But do think about what is the difference between virtue ethics and the other systems? Because I do think that thinking in terms of virtue ethics will get you closer to understanding how to live a Christian life than just thinking about issues and how you make decisions in the face of issues. It changes how you approach an ethical issue, because it's not just about finding verses that will give you the rule to follow. It is about how do I align myself with God's desires in this issue. Incidentally, the world, although public discussion is still very much in terms of consequentialism, and it will appeal to deontology in different ways, it is turning more to virtue ethics. In the academic discussion, you'll find a lot more talk about virtue ethics these days. There's been a real resurgence in it. Partly, I think, because the other systems have been shown to fail in so many different ways. But, sorry, this is what virtue issue is. What sort of person am I? The world is turning to the self more, about how to make the person flourish. So, for instance, marriage might be right for one person and wrong for another person. It doesn't become an ethical issue on its own. Even something like fidelity, whereas in past times most people would agree, fidelity, keeping your promises, being faithful to the person you've promised to be faithful to, that's just the rule. That's the right thing to do. But now you'll find that because a lot of discussion is turning to the individual more, it's saying the rule isn't a rule anymore. It's not about whether the action itself is right or wrong. It is about what difference it makes to the person. So just on Sunday, there was an article in the Sunday Times, and the headline was this: "I don't feel guilty about my affair. It was good for me." And the subheading was, "A new study shows that women are less damaged by their own infidelity than men. Here 3 writers reveal how it was for them." Well, who cares how it was for them? They did something wrong. But of course, that's the shift we're getting in moral discussion these days. No, you can't say it was wrong because it might have been good for them. It's sort of this funny combination of consequentialism with virtue ethics. And of course, that's the real problem with virtue ethics as a system. You still need to know what your values are before you can actually use it to decide what's ethical. The weakness of virtue ethic is that it destroys the concept of right and wrong in itself in favour of personal flourishing. And it assumes that the flourishing person is the one who lives for fulfilling their own desires. And now that's good in the sense that we can have fruitful conversations about what does make for human flourishing. You know, what is the best thing for you as a person? And we can talk about, well, who actually understands people the best? Who actually knows what it is for a human to flourish? Well, the creator of those people is the one who actually knows how to make people flourish. Okay, so these are the three major systems you'll reach. And I want you to be able to recognise when arguments are being made in terms of each of those three systems, because that's how you can understand how a person is coming to their ethical decisions and how you can enter into that conversation without talking past each other. So that we don't get situations where a government says our policy on immigrants is right because it works, and another person is saying, but you just can't treat people that way. Those two arguments are not going to mesh because they're based on different systems of how you make ethical decisions. But if you can understand how a person is coming to their decision, then you can enter their decision-making process. You can enter the conversation with them. But the final thing I want to say about all of these systems, they all come to this problem: why should I? No matter what your ethical system is, in the end, why should I? Why should I do what this system says I should do? And that's because, well, all these systems will say they're good because they depend on human reason. But in the end, what we're saying is that depends on instinct. Because you can rationally argue different conclusions from any of these systems, depending on what your instinct is. And that's what you'll find a lot of what goes in the guise of ethical discussion is actually people trying to defend their own instincts. You need an objective standard if you are actually going to make ethical decisions, if you are actually going to find out what is right and what is wrong. And so that's what we're going to turn to after lunch. How do we use that ethical standard? We know we have one. We know we have the Creator God who tells us what to do. How are we actually going to use his word to come to our ethical decisions? Okay, I think it's lunchtime.